Hello, Sarah of SEK Handmade here, and I am so excited to be back to you to talk more about gauge. In my previous videos, we discussed what the heck is gauge and why does it even matter, as well as how to make the best gauge swatch possible. If you have done much gauge swatching, though, you know that one gauge swatch is often not the end of it. If you are looking for a very specific or a specific fit, it doesn't even have to be very specific, but if you're looking for a specific fit or you're working within a really set amount of yarn yardage, having a really accurate gauge swatch that meets the designer's gauge as closely as possible can be super important. Today, we're going to talk about the many factors that can affect your gauge swatch and how you can be aware of those things and change them up to hopefully meet the designer's gauge as closely as possible. The first thing that can have a big effect on your gauge is the yarn you've chosen to work with. Now, a lot of times the yarn that the designer used is either unavailable to you or it just isn't the yarn you want to use, and so you've made a yarn substitution. This is totally normal and necessary and great. However, if the yarn you chose does not match what the designer used pretty closely, it can definitely affect your gauge. I have a couple videos on yarn substitution that I'll link in the description below. So if you're thinking that your yarn that you substituted might be the issue, go watch those videos. I go deep into how to make the best yarn substitutions. The two issues that you could be facing are yarn weight. The weights of fingering, worsted, DK, bulky are categories, and yarns can fall in a range from light to heavy within those categories. So if your pattern said a worsted weight yarn and you chose a heavy worsted weight yarn and the designer chose a light worsted weight yarn, you could have a really hard time meeting gauge with your heavier yarn. If you don't know exactly where the designer's yarn fell in that range, be sure to look it up on the internet and find the yard to, or the length to weight ratio. So either the yards or meters as compared to the ounces or grams. That I talk more in depth about that ratio in my yarn substitution videos. But if your yarn ratios are off, especially if they're significantly off from what the designer used, it can make meeting gauge really hard. The other thing that we often don't think about is the fact that fiber content can play a big role in how a yarn works up. So if you have gone far away, or maybe even just a hop away from the original yarn's fiber content, you may want to look at scooching back closer to that original fiber content to help you meet gauge. Another thing that can really affect gauge is your hook. And you may be saying, but Sarah, I've tried 7 different hook sizes and I haven't met gauge. I'm not talking about the size of your hook. I'm talking about the material that your hook is made out of. Whether it is made out of aluminum, steel, resin, wood, bamboo, those can all affect your gauge. Some materials are grippier and will tighten up your gauge, and other materials are slippery and can loosen up your gauge. So if you have hooks available to change the material of hook you're using, give that a try and see if it makes a difference. Let me know if you can feel the pain of this next one. The thing that may be affecting your gauge is your golden loop. You'll know that this is a problem if you are meeting stitches, but not meeting row gauge. This can be incredibly frustrating. You've got your stitches spot on and your row height is off. That's going to be because of your golden loop. And while a golden loop sounds very fancy, it simply means that first loop you pull up after inserting your hook into the stitches below. That's your golden loop. And there are whole theories on different types of golden loops, but the main idea is if you pull that first loop tight, your row height is going to be shorter. If you're someone who lifts that first loop up higher, your rows are going to be taller. So if you are meeting stitch gauge but not row gauge, you can try adjusting your golden loop to fix that problem. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that these next two factors may be things that you've never thought of. The first one is the environment. Yes, the weather around you can affect your gauge. If you have ever taken your yarn outside on a hot and humid day, you probably know the feeling of that yarn sticking in your fingers a little more. This does not make stitching impossible, but it definitely can tighten up your gauge. So it's important to keep in mind where you'll be working the final project as you do your gauge swatch, because it would be totally inaccurate to do a gauge swatch out in super humid weather and then work your project inside in the air conditioning where the yarn slides more smoothly through your fingers. The information that humid gauge swatch gave you is not going to be the same as your final project. So watch out for weather conditions. And then also there's the human factor. If your hands are super dry, they can cause the yarn to catch and grip on your fingers. The other thing is, if you've ever put lotion on your hands and immediately sat down to work with your yarn, you know that extra moisture on your hands can also grip the yarn a little more. There are lots and lots of other human factors. Of course, it's handmade, but human factors that can play into making the best gauge swatch possible and meeting gauge. And those are things like emotions. If you are watching a scary or suspenseful movie, you can definitely tighten up your gauge sometimes. The other thing is, if you are in pain, that can also tighten up your gauge. And likely, if you have swatched several times, you might be feeling frustrated, and those emotions of frustration can definitely have an effect on your gauge. So if you are looking for a really accurate gauge and you are struggling to meet it, keep both those environmental and human factors in mind. And if you can change any of those, and it may be as simple as coming inside from outside, or taking a break, walking away from the infuriating gauge swatch and coming back later and trying again. Remember, the purpose of our gauge swatch is to give us the most accurate information possible. And if these other factors are throwing it off, it's not going to do that. So even though it can feel like a waste of time, oftentimes it can be best to just take a step back and try again later. Whew. That is a lot of things that could be affecting our gauge. If you are feeling frustrated by gauge swatching, I really encourage you to think about what are some of the different factors that could be affecting your gauge and how could you switch them up to potentially meet gauge better. This is a meaty topic with lots of information. More videos are coming, and there's lots of resources in the description below. So I really encourage you to check that out, especially my videos on yarn substitution, because again, that can play a big role in your gauge swatching, as well as a link to my free gauge swatch info sheet. That's going to give you some important reminders, as well as give you a space to write down all the information you need while you are gauge swatching to make the best gauge swatches possible. As always, it is my goal to help you grow confidently in your craft And I hope this video has helped to do that. If it has, I would love it if you would share it with a friend who might also benefit from this information. After you've done that, I'd love it if you would like it and subscribe to my channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss out any information I share. Thank you so much for joining me today, and happy crafting!